I'm a reporter, but mostly I cover crime, uh, homicides and such, and this was nothing I'd ever encountered. First off, you had a pipeline was the assailant. How could that happen? You know, how could a pipeline just, normally speaking, you know, common sense as a reporter, you'd think, well, you know, somebody must have dug into it or hit it with a spike or maybe, you know, who knows what happened. But it just didn't seem to make any sense at all that first that everybody thought it was a plane crash and the reporters couldn't get near it and the firefighters couldn't get near it, and it kept going on and people just stared at it on television for about an hour and a half. And I heard an anecdote that one of the people who was in charge of trying to turn off the line couldn't reach anybody, so he called his wife and asked her, am I making any progress as he turned the valve of the pipe manually? And she said, yeah, you're turning off the gas. This was 90 minutes into it. So we were, as reporters at the Chronicle and other reporters across California and even the United States started to look at this. One of the first questions we had to ask is, how is it that a pipe just could burst under the ground with nothing apparently acting on it? And one of the things that we learned was that pressure had started to ratchet up because there was an equipment failure at a transmission compression, it's a station where the gas is regulated and controlled, it's unmanned. And there was some power issues there, and the valves or the regulators started to open automatically. And one of the first things I wondered is, how does something fail open? In other words, if you have a power failure, this particular device turned up the gas full. Why would they do that? It just didn't make any sense. I mean, you'd think it would either fail in place and not turn up the gas or start to turn the gas down. Well, why turn up the gas if you've lost power? And we also started looking at the regulatory system in that we didn't really know what had happened, but we did know one thing, that the regulators should know what happened. And we didn't get a whole lot of information from them. So we started looking at the regulatory system in the United States. And what we learned was that while everybody was trained or had to agree to be trained to obtain federal funding, there really wasn't any monitoring about what actually happened after that. Basically, they told everybody that everybody went through the seminar, they went through the training, but every state, as long as they agreed to adopt the federal rules, could basically do what they saw fit. Is one of the strange terms we've learned is something called voluntary compliance, which meant that they made a not so official agreement that if PG&E and other utilities admitted to problems, they would basically pat them on the back and say, okay, we'll write you a note saying you violated the law, you go fix it. And that was the idea of encouraging a good safety culture. But it also, with that kind of agreement, there was never any thought to go further to regulatory action, to fining or to seek compliance orders by judges. So what happened was is that basically if PG&E and the regulator, the California Public Utilities Commission's engineers, if they disagreed about something, PG&E would essentially win because there was no court of appeal, there was no action that could be done. So, and what we learned was that PG&E accounted for the bulk of the violations that were found, yet had not been fined anything. They hadn't even sought fines against them for more than a decade. Then we looked at how California, which everybody sees as a very liberal state, had actually the lowest staff of inspectors per mile of pipelines of any state in the country. That relied on, the federal government relied on doing this inspection. California has more than 100,000 miles of lines, and yet it had 7 inspectors. Now, we didn't expect the inspectors to go out there and troll the gas miles under the ground, but the only way we could measure the kind of job, the mission that they had, was to look at the number of miles in the system. Texas, Louisiana, other states had far more inspectors, and we just didn't understand how that could even work. And so that's where the voluntary compliance came in. They would essentially say, okay, well, we don't have the staff to regulate you. You just basically have to, we'll give you guidance, and you guys decide what's best. And although in theory it sounded, like an accommodation based on resources, in practice it worked out if essentially there was no one to stop what some people have argued were abuses of the system. What ultimately the National Transportation Safety Board found was integrity management without integrity. And one of the things we also learned, there were several strange things that, of course, as a crime reporter, I'd never heard of anything called direct assessment, which is actually not direct at all. It's actually from above the ground. You monitor the pipeline for corrosion below the ground using sophisticated equipment, but it's not direct. And then I learned something, probable impact radius, which sounds like something you would hear about in nuclear weapons, is actually the estimated area of a pipeline based on its MAOP and characteristics, how many people would be instantly affected, and then also how long would it take someone to run to get away or to find a structure in which they could seek haven. And they would have to run the quarter of the speed of an Olympic sprinter based on the model that had been adopted regulatorily a decade before. So all I can say is that when we peeled back the onion, as it were, of how the system worked, it seemed to that risk was judged by the greatest risk. If you eliminate risk management, if you eliminate the greatest risk, the next risk in line becomes the number one risk. Well, in the case of PG&E, their perception was their greatest risk was corrosion. So they developed an entire risk management structure based on their fundamental belief that corrosion was on their risk, was the only risk they needed to really keep track of. So that meant that in this case, in the San Bruno line, defective welds became their number one risk. But their program wasn't to monitor that because of these regulations, which as a crime reporter I struggled to understand, basically said that if you have a problem in the ground and pressures don't go too high, you don't have to worry. It'll remain stable. It's never going to get worse. And that's like saying if I took, I thought of it as like, well, okay, if I take an EKG at 40, when I'm 60, my EKG was fine at 40 and I haven't done any exercise, it's going to be the same. Logically, some of this stuff just was puzzling to me and to anyone who, a lot of people we talked to and the experts that we talked to were just this idea of stable versus unstable defects, MAOP, why a 5-year window of pressure could somehow be some sort of scientific measure of the fitness for service of a pipeline, how you could assume defects were never going to get worse based on normal service in a gas line. And what we found here was, and of course the whole issue that Jackie Spear has been very ardently vocal about, the issue of grandfathering, how you could assume a safe pressure based on operating levels between 1966 and 1970 is somehow at any relevance today. What do we know about, is that saying that we know as much about pipeline safety today as we knew about in 1966? I don't know. I mean, anyway, as a reporter, what we did was we tried to find out where the information could be obtained and also who was responsible for acting. And we found that it was this hodgepodge of state regulators, 48 different groups, had to try to interpret federal law, act on them, and they'd all come up with different scenarios. Some states believe in no fines. Some states believe in fines. They say that that's the only way to get the attention of the pipeline operators. I don't know the truth about what works, but there's no science behind it. There's no studies. Nobody's ever said, how do you develop a safety culture? What goes on behind that? So as we continued, and the story just kept going on because events kept drawing it forward. And all I can say is, what have we learned about San Bruno? The question I have is, what haven't we learned? In that, what don't we know? Because there's so many assumptions in the way pipelines are operated. There's a lack of data of how many pipelines have been grandfathered, what their status is today. The questions just keep going. I mean, and this story is just not going away. Thank you very much.